Well, good day to everybody. Since I am not in class today, I wanted to share this video with you about the age of exploration so you get some kind of content for our very last lesson of the year. All right, so this is all about the explorers and the beginning of world exploration throughout our little blue planet. All right, and we're going to focus on one or two different countries who really kind of took hold of this and made it a thing. All right, the biggest one is Portugal. Smallest country, biggest input. So the central question has to do with how they were able to actually lead the way in this exploration and not places like Spain and England and France, right? So how was a small country able to accomplish that before much larger, wealthier nations? So your key terms are pretty short this week. We've got a man named Henry the Navigator. He's the Prince of Portugal. He opened the school for navigation. Navigator is just a fancy word for explorer or a sailor. The Portuguese created a ship that was perfect for all of this worldly travel called a caravel. It was stronger, faster, easier to steer than most other boats, better to go out into the open oceans. One of the tools they established was called the astrolabe. Essentially, you would use the stars to figure out where on the Earth you were and how far from the equator you are from. Gilgamesh was a Portuguese explorer. He was the first person to sail past a line called Cape Bojador. I'll show you that later on. Vasco da Gama, he was the Portuguese sailor who was the first to sail around Africa and get to Asia. King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella were the Spanish monarchs. They're the ones who sponsored Christopher Columbus on his trip across the Atlantic Ocean. Ferdinand Magellan, he is given credit for sailing around the world or circumnavigating, although he didn't quite make it all the way. We'll talk about that in a little bit too. And then to circumnavigate means to sail around the world. Right? He was the first person to lead the charge in actually attempting that. Okay, so one of the first things that we talked about were the trade routes going through the Mediterranean Sea and how those North Italian city-states like Genoa, Venice, Naples, Florence were the ones who were controlling all those trade routes. All right, and that got other countries thinking about finding other ways to get to Asia because the Asian goods were still very highly sought after. But the high taxes from these Italian merchants, they really kind of put a dent in the pocketbook. So other countries were trying to figure out ways to get to Asia without having to use, North Italian trade routes. Portugal was the first person to be able to do so. One of the reasons why is because England and France were constantly fighting each other over land and titles and wealth and things like that. And they're always fighting. They're constantly fighting. They're going to keep on fighting for the next 200 years. The Spanish were involved with a war against themselves with a Muslim invasion from Africa. So if we're looking, Africa right here, all right, we see Egypt, Cairo, Algeria. This is a very Muslim territory. And they worked their way up here into the Iberian Peninsula where Spain is. Spain is a mostly Catholic kingdom. And so when they had this Muslim invasion, they at some point decided it was time to expel the Muslims from their lands. And that happened during this exact same time. So England and France are fighting each other because they're always fighting each other. And the Spanish were involved with trying to expel the Muslims from their kingdom. That left Portugal as a way to actually lead the way in all this because they're not doing anything. They're not involved in any of this stuff. So Portugal it was. Their location gave them a history of sailing. So you look over here, this is Portugal, this dark green area on the map. And you notice that half of their country is Atlantic Ocean coastline. So because of that, they were expert sailors. They used the oceans and the seas, okay, to actually navigate and live their lives, much like the way the Greeks did in ancient times. The geography forced them into becoming these expert sailors. So their location and this kind of kingdom that they had really led the way for them to actually become these super expert sailors. All right. It all started in 1419 with a man named Henry. Henry was a prince in Portugal, and he decided to lead the way in ocean navigation. He opens a school. Because how else are you going to learn how to sail a boat and create new cool tools besides, at a school? He earned the nickname Henry the Navigator because of this school that he actually set up for his country. One of the biggest accomplishments of the school was a new form of ship called a caravel. This is it in the upper right-hand corner, right here. Here's the caravel. What made it better was it was a bigger ship, it was a faster ship, and it was easier to steer in the open ocean opposed to places like the Mediterranean Sea, Black Sea, where it wasn't nearly as choppy with the large waves. So ocean exploration became a huge deal because of the design of this ship. Large center mast right here in the middle, and then smaller sails around the edges here to make it easier for steering. They also started using compasses, all right, but they wouldn't use those ancient Chinese ones. They had established their own and had kind of improved on them. They began creating maps of areas so they can figure out where things are, and they started using cartographers to map out certain locations, and we're going to see that in a few minutes. And then they also had this instrument called an astrolabe. The astrolabe could tell you how far you were from the equator using stars and navigational charts. So all of these advancements in technology helped them become these expert sailors or these navigators. And they really were the first European country to try and explore the open oceans. Here we have some pictures of the school, what's left of it, right? Bottom left here. Part of the school, upper left here, part of the school. It's an old ruin, a museum now. You can go visit it if you ever go to Portugal. And the big one here in the center of the screen, this is the monument to Prince Henry the Navigator, as Portugal gets its history from that era. They're known to be navigators and sailors and things like that. So this is Henry right here, looking out over the open ocean as he begins to explore. Okay, so one of the things at this time is that open ocean sailing wasn't really a thing. No one in Europe had ever been close to sailing past this line, okay? This line in Africa is where Cape Bojador, you can see the word right here, was on their maps. And no European had ever been south of this line. One of the reasons why is because they were scared, right? In this area, it was all kinds of stories about sea monsters and the Kraken and large sea creatures that could eat your whole ship. And, that's, once you hear one story, it snowballs out of, it snowballs into a huge false, right? They don't exist. They're talking about whales, right? And since when do whales ever hurt anybody? You see a giant squid and it freaks you out. Well, the giant squid is probably more scared of you than you are of it. So when you're out in the open ocean and you see these large sea animals like sperm whales and humpback whales and large squids and things like that, when you get to the south part of Africa, you're going to start seeing great white sharks. These are monsters of the sea. Well, people's imagination kind of run wild. So no one had really been through this part of Africa before until a man named Gil Yanis decided he was going to be the first person to sail across this cape and really see what's on the other side of Africa, because they really have no idea how big it is, right? There's 4 cardinal directions: north, south, east, west. And if you're looking for Asia, you're going to have to go in one of those directions. Well, if you're going to go east, right, this direction, well, the Italian merchants have a lock on these trade routes in the Mediterranean Sea, which is right up here. Right? So there's 3 more directions you can go. You can go north, you can go south, you can go west. Well, to the north is the Arctic Circle, and they know that, and that's cold, so they're not going over there. West is the Atlantic Ocean. They're not sure how big that is, so they're not going to go that way. To the south is Africa. They know that Africa's there, so they're going to try and figure out how big Africa actually is, and they're going to establish exploration and navigation through this area. And Gil Yanis is the first to do it. Most people don't really know how big Africa actually is because most maps do not do it justice. Africa is probably the largest continent on the planet. The entire country of China, which is one of the largest countries in the world, would fit right about here. All right? So the Europeans really don't have that great of an idea of how big Africa actually is, but they're about to find out. And Gil Yanis is the explorer who's going to do that. And he's going to explore the wind patterns and the currents, and he's going to map out these coastlines and basically get a general information about what's happening. All right? And here we have the reasons why no one ever crossed Cape Bojador. from Europe because they get these crazy stories about Loch Ness monsters and giant squid, the Kraken's gonna eat your boat, and yeah, it's all garbage, right? When you're drawing maps like this one right here, and half of the map is land and the other half is the water full of these giant creatures that are gonna destroy you, it makes your imagination kind of run wild. So most people did not really want to go at those places because they're afraid the sea monsters are gonna get them. Kind of ridiculous. Okay, everyone knows humpback whales are just big cows. All right, so Gillianis, he uses and he figures out and he maps out all of the wind patterns and the ocean currents and the coastlines on Africa's west coast. Okay, he gets past Cape Bojador. The next person is Bartolomeu Diaz, and he will go beyond Cape Bojador and he will go all the way down to the southern part of Africa and really start mapping out and figuring out these currents and wind patterns for this general area. Okay, now he only gets to South Africa because they don't know how big Africa actually is. So Diaz in 1487, he's got to pack up his ships for a certain amount of supplies. Well, at some point, you're gonna start running low on supplies, and you're gonna need to turn around and go back to Portugal because fresh water, food, they do run out. And there's not like a Meijer or a Kroger you can go to out in the Atlantic Ocean. All right, so they get down just about here to the southern part of Africa, and Diaz and his crew, they turn around and go back up to Portugal. Now, he's charting all these coastlines and establishing relationships with some of the people, but he's never really going interior. He also began setting up like these Christian missions to help convert the population to Christianity because, you know, the 3 G's, God, glory, and gold, God being a pretty important one. All right, fast forward about 10 years, and the next Portuguese explorer, Vasco da Gama, is going to continue where Diaz left off. So where Diaz stopped right about down here and returned home, da Gama, he goes a different route. He doesn't need to go this way anymore because Diaz already did it. Africa's mapped out, they know the currents. So da Gama is gonna go all the way out. He's gonna go a little further out in the Atlantic Ocean, all right, and slingshot himself around the part of Africa and then up here onto East Africa. Now you'll notice this word right there, that's Kilwa. So you remember the city-states of Kilwa on the east coast of Africa were the trading empire. Well, we talked about during the Africa lesson, if you remember, that Kilwa was conquered by a European country as they began ocean exploration. That country is Portugal. That person is Vasco da Gama. He will take over and conquer these city-states in the name of Portugal, and then eventually shoot himself across the Indian Ocean and into this area of the world, which would be India. And if you look closely, India is a part of what larger continent? Asia. Right? And the whole point of this exploration is to figure out how to get Asian goods at a cheaper rate than having to pay the Italian merchants. So Portugal, through Bartolomeu Diaz, Gillianis, and Vasco da Gama, have now found their trade route to Africa. Sorry, not Africa, to Asia, where they can get spices and silks and jade and all the good stuff. All right? So no more paying the Italian merchant taxes on imported goods. Now they can just get it for themselves. Wholesale. All right. Now, Vasco da Gama would take a second voyage as he's going to India, but this time, instead of making friends or being nice people, the Portuguese sailor and explorer decided he was going to conquer these city-states on India. The problem is, India is a very proud country, and they don't like that very much. All right, they would not submit control of any of these city-states to the Portuguese, even though Portuguese really, really wanted it. Da Gama is very, very unsuccessful in this adventure and does not conquer many of these city-states in the name of Portugal or in the name of Europe or anything like that. India won't become a part of any other European country until much later when Britain conquers it. You can talk about that next year when you're a freshman. Okay, Spanish do get involved now. So the king and queen of Spain are Isabel and Ferdinand, and they are done fighting the Muslims. They have won in the name of God and Catholicism and all that stuff. So they decide they're going to start getting involved in this world exploration game. So A man by the name of Christopher Columbus is looking to make a name for himself in world exploration. The problem is he's Italian, and the Italians are not world explorers. They control the Mediterranean Sea, and they're happy with it. So he's got to go to other monarchs throughout Europe to try and figure out if they're going to allow him to be sponsored and pay for his trips across the ocean. Now, the Italians go in the direction of east. The Portuguese, they go south, and they're not going to want to share those trade routes. North is the Arctic Circle. No one's going there. It's too cold. So the only direction you can go now is west, and they're not sure what is west. They know there's an ocean there. It's the Atlantic, but they're not quite sure how big it actually is. So Ferdinand and Isabella sponsor Columbus on a very daring journey to cross the Atlantic Ocean to go try and find Asia. And they tell him, you're going to do these things. You're going to try and find wealth, the gold. You're going to spread glory for yourself, and then you're going to spread the Catholic faith. So God, gold, glory. The king and queen are very much into the God and gold category. They want the wealth, and they want to spread their religion around the world. Columbus is more into the glory aspect of it all. He wants to make a name for himself as a prime explorer and navigator. All right, so we know the story. Columbus sails across the ocean to these quote-unquote discovered unknown lands. Well, the problem with that, though, is that if people already live there, is it undiscovered? No, because there's already humans there. It is unknown to Europe, not the rest of the natives who are living there. He would land at an island between North and South America near what we call the Caribbean Sea. He would make 4 trips back and forth in approximately 8 years. There was a 5th attempt made, but eventually refused by Queen Isabella. See, Columbus wasn't exactly playing by the rules. One of the things that Isabella had said is that we are not slave traders, so do not bring slaves back to be sold. Well, on the first trip, Christopher Columbus brings a whole bunch of stuff back from the Americas, and one of them being people. And he uses them as slaves and would put them into slave markets and things like that. And that's a big kind of like a big slap on the hand for Isabella. I told you not to do this, right? Don't bring slaves back. And so Columbus says, okay. And the second trip was sponsored because he was successful in finding new continents for the Spanish queen. And again, he comes back with slaves. And Isabella, frustrated, tells him not to do it again. Right, second time, now Columbus, we're not supposed to take slaves back, we don't agree with this. Well, Columbus kept on doing it. After the 4th time, he kept on bringing slaves back. He tried to do it very sneakily, and in doing so was found out, and Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand cut him off. They refused to sponsor him a 5th time. He just would not listen about the slave trade. The Queen warned him, he didn't listen, so you're cut off. And he would be kind of ostracized for most of the rest of his life because of this. So here's the map of all of his trips. So this red line is his first trip, okay, from the Iberian Peninsula up here, going across. It took him a while. They didn't know the currents and the ocean currents and the wind patterns. He lands right in here, okay, which is part of Cuba, and then he goes back home. Later that same year, they pack up, they travel again. That's the green line. This time they're going to do more exploration throughout all of the Caribbean. This island right here is the modern day island of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And they set up kind of like a small camp or fort on this island, and then they go back to Europe. A couple of years later, he gets sponsored again. This time he explores further south, the northern part of South America. And then from here, he goes back up to his camp, realized that those who had stayed behind no longer are there and they have deceased, and then goes back to Europe. And then his last trip is this yellowish orange line right here, 1502 to 1504. And now he's going to get more into what is Central America, Nicaragua, Ecuador, things like that. All right, and it's part of the Caribbean down here again, and then shoot himself back over to Europe to finish it up. That ended in 1500, and he would never go back again. He becomes, like I said before, ostracized. He's basically kind of kicked out. All right, next up is a man named Ferdinand Magellan. Now, Magellan was a man who had aspirations to what's called circumnavigate the globe. He wanted to be the first person to go all the way around the world. And at this time, the Americas have been mapped, they've been named, and he is now looking to figure out a way to go around them and find Asia going east. Sorry, west, sailing west. All right, now, the King of Portugal refuses to sponsor Magellan. He's happy with his trade routes going south. So in 1519, Magellan sets sail through the Spanish again. All right, so the Spanish are the ones who sponsor him, and they sail off with 5 ships, a crew of 250 men, and they sail from Spain, right there, or down past Africa, and they shoot right across this narrow, I say narrow very loosely, gap between the two continents. And his job is going to be to travel the South American border right here on the coastline, map it out, wind patterns, ocean currents, all the things. Okay, and it's a much bigger continent than I think they thought it was going to be. And at some point, he comes across this gap in the land. He thinks it's a shortcut. You can see it right there on this map. It looks like a shortcut, but it didn't end up being a shortcut. It ends up costing him 38 extra days trying to figure out and navigate through this really cluster of small rocky islands. It did not go well. If you remember, we talked about Bartholomew Diaz and supplies and water. Well, if you're traveling around the world, you only have a limited supply, right? And they just lost 38 days worth of food and water. So they're kind of in a pinch. So much so that upon getting to the Pacific Ocean, they began eating moldy, wormy biscuits. They would eat sawdust. They would eat leather, anything that was made from animals or from nature that's just to stave off the hunger. It was a brutal, brutal time because the Pacific Ocean, as we know, but he did not, is the largest body of water on our planet, and he had to cross it not knowing how big it actually was. Okay, here is a look at the southern part of South America. Here is the entrance to the Strait of Magellan. Okay, there it is. It's just a giant maze, and getting 5 ships through there, getting tangled up, you just never know. You take a wrong turn, you wind up in here somewhere. You're not exactly sure where you're at, and you got to go back again. And, it's just a maze. And if you look at the entrance right here, how close it is to right down there, what took him 38 days to navigate through probably would have taken him like maybe a week to go around the southern tip, which is called the Cape Horn is what it's called. All right, so he lost 38 days when he shouldn't have, and it cost him big time. Okay, they finally get across the Pacific Ocean and they land on an island in the Philippines. The Philippines is an island nation, thousands of islands. He lands trying to resupply and to gain some water, and the whole 3Gs thing, God, glory, gold. Upon landing on one of these islands, the local natives agreed to help with Magellan and his crew if they helped them in this tribal war they were in the middle of. So Magellan gets involved in the tribal war, but while he is there, if you can see by the picture, he's actually killed in battle. He's stabbed in the back by a spear by one of these opposing armies. So Magellan never gets back to Europe. All right, he dies in the Philippines, which is about 2/3 of the voyage, but he gets credit for it because it was his exploration. So upon returning to Europe after this whole battle with the Filipino natives, of the 5 ships, only 1 made it, the Victoria. Of the 250 men, only 18 men returned to Spain. And Ferdinand Magellan gets the credit for circumnavigating the globe, even though he quite never did make it there. All right, folks, that is what I have for this lesson. All right, we've got circumnavigation, we've got Christopher Columbus as the slave trader that no one really knows about, but he was a slave trader for himself only, kind of a selfish guy. And then we get into the very first people to actually sail in the open oceans, and that would be the Portuguese under Henry the Navigator. All right, I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and I will see you later.